Today is September 29th, 2023, and this is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. Recently, in studying early American history, I was directed to a work published by a man named Isaac Backus, who lived in the 18th century, 1700s America, who was influential in promoting religious freedom in America during the time when the Americans were establishing their independence and moving towards a new constitution. This freedom of religion we more or less take for granted today, but at the time, freedom of religion was talked about, much like slavery. There was a lot of talk about what the right thing to do was, but it wasn't actually done. For example, with slavery, there were, I think more than most people realize, there were Americans eager to abolish slavery. The problem was that it was ingrained into the economy of several of the colonies, and it was going to need to be removed piece by piece, little by little. That was the problem. It wasn't that Americans wanted slavery at that time. They were realizing that if they were going to establish the Constitution that they wanted to establish, and if they wanted to talk about all men being created equal and having the same natural right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, you couldn't have this big elephant of slavery standing there in the room. Americans knew that, but it was a matter of time until they actually did something about it. But to be fair, if you look in the Constitution, there is a section of the Constitution that reveals that it's expected that Congress is going to move to either abolish or regulate slavery. So just as the Americans wrestled with that question of freedom and slavery, or liberty and slavery, the Americans also wrestled with questions of religious freedom. It was obvious, if we go back to the 1600s, we can read the creeds that were published, the confessions and catechisms that were published at the time of the Protestant Reformation, especially in England. We can read the Westminster Confession. We can read the London Baptist Confession of 1689. I think Westminster was published in 1646 or 1647. And if you look at those old Protestant confessions, you'll find a chapter on the topic of Christian liberty, the liberty of conscience that the Protestants taught all Christians enjoy in Christ, that God alone is Lord of the conscience, and that every man is free to worship God as he judges best according to his own study of God's Word, the Bible. That was the idea of Christian liberty among the Protestants, and you can imagine that they clung to that doctrine as a defense against what they considered to be the spiritual tyranny of Roman Catholicism. So we can understand how the doctrine of Christian liberty, or liberty of conscience, became so central to the Protestant mission. However, when these Protestants came to the New World, and remember, they were coming to the New World to escape that religious persecution or influence that they found so offensive and frustrating. When they came to the New World, they almost always contradicted themselves by setting up societies, even formally setting up states with constitutions that didn't respect this religious freedom or this liberty of conscience that they talked about in their confessions. For example, in Virginia, we've got someone like James Madison thinking and talking and writing about religious freedom. And yet in Virginia, in that same state, the Anglican Church is established by the state of Virginia as the state church and is financially supported by funds collected from all of the residents of Virginia. So if you were a Baptist living in Virginia, you were required to financially support the Anglican Church. So it's easy to talk about religious freedom when you're an Anglican in Virginia, but what if you're a Baptist in Virginia? Then the issue isn't so simple. And it was obvious that this was going to be a problem, and eventually it was resolved. But we have there an idea of religious toleration, like the kind that we saw in the Roman Empire when the Emperor Galerius published his Edict of Toleration before, I think it was 311 AD. We see toleration for other religious practices, but we don't see a respect and freedom for religious practices. We don't see the state avoiding the discouragement of different religions. We see toleration, but not freedom. And so Isaac Backus was another example. Was up in Massachusetts. Up in Massachusetts, the Constitution that was established in, I think it was 1780 in Massachusetts, called for the state funding of Protestant teachers who were basically representatives of the state, and the state identified them as teachers of morals. They were to be supported by the state, but they had to be, and this was in the Constitution, they had to be Protestants. So there's talk of religious freedom, but what that talk usually means is you're free to practice any religion you want as long as it's a religion that we like. And obviously, even today, that's what we mean by religious freedom. We're not saying that someone can decide to revive the religion of the ancient Aztecs. We can't have human sacrifices in the name of religion. We go to war with a Muslim country that claims to be, responsible for some jihad or holy war against infidels. We obviously don't believe in religious freedom in some absolute sense, in some unrestricted way. And this is one of the built-in problems with religious freedom. It's, we believe that every man is free to worship God as he chooses, but, not really. So this religious freedom was always an itchy subject in early America, and we can see that when the founding fathers were willing to grant religious freedom to other Christian groups, even groups that they thought were really strange, like the Quakers, they really didn't foresee just how diverse immigration into America would become. They talked about it. Some who actually objected to religious freedom talked about, what's going to happen when the Catholics start coming, what's going to happen when the Muslims start coming, or the Jews, and so on. So there were some who saw trouble down the road for this idea of Christian America. But nevertheless, they built this idea of religious freedom into the Constitution, more specifically into the Bill of Rights, which guaranteed that no state religion would ever be established in America. But it's always this uncomfortable issue to discuss. Now, the reason why I bring up Isaac Backus is because he was a Baptist. And we hear the word Baptist today, and not many people understand what a Baptist really is, especially in historical context. Now, I'd like to explain that real quick. At the time of the Reformation, especially in England, you had the ancient practice in the Catholic Church of infant baptism. When children are born, they are baptized into the Catholic Church right after birth. The children have no idea what's going on. They're not asked. They don't consent. They are baptized by the authority of their parents and received or initiated into the church as Christians. This is called infant baptism or pedo baptism. Now, at the time of the Reformation, Protestants practiced that same tradition. Anglicans, Presbyterians, Congregationalists, they all practiced infant baptism. But really, when we consider this idea, this Protestant idea of liberty of conscience, we have to look at that, and I'm saying this from the Protestant perspective. We have to look at this practice of infant baptism and say, does that really follow from this doctrine of Christian liberty? Does infant baptism really respect the liberty of conscience of an individual born into the world and declared to be an Anglican or a Presbyterian or a Congregationalist or a Catholic with no understanding, no consent, and so on? Is that really Christian practice? And the Baptists, this is what makes Baptists Baptists. They said, no, this practice of infant baptism is a kind of spiritual tyranny that has been retained from the Roman Catholic Church. It denies individual children freedom of religion. It denies this doctrine of Christian liberty and needs to be rejected. So to be a Baptist meant that you did not practice infant baptism, but saw a child born into the world as an unbeliever who needed to be evangelized and taught, but allowed to come to the faith on his own. And so there was a respect of religious freedom, a respect of liberty of conscience, and the child was left to make the decision to become a Christian on his own. And so we don't have pedo baptism or infant baptism among Baptists. We have what's called credo baptism, that is, the baptism of a believer. This is what separated the Baptists from other Christian groups and from, well, I should say, other Protestant groups and also from Catholics. Now, if you take that idea that the Baptists propose, that no one should be initiated into a religion without his consent, sure seems to make a lot of sense, especially if you've already granted much of the Protestant argument. And so the influence of the Baptists was quite strong. And today, if we look among non-Catholic Christians today, we find that this idea of credo rather than pedo baptism is quite normal. I'll just ask you, think about Protestants that Protestant families. How many of them do you know that baptize their infants? If they're Presbyterians, they probably do. If they're Anglicans or Episcopalians, they probably do. There aren't many Congregationalists around anymore, so it might be pretty rare to actually know Protestant or non-Catholic Christian families that baptize their babies. Many Catholics take it for granted, probably don't even think about it very much, but it's really a controversial practice when the principles of Protestant teaching are accepted. And the Baptists pointed this out, and like I said, in 1647, the Protestants in England published what was called the Westminster Confession of Faith, 1647, and then 40 years later or so, the Baptists amended, or I should say edited, the Westminster Confession and published what's known as the London Baptist Confession of 1689. And you can see the differences between that doctrine of those who saw salvation as a covenant between God and a family, and those who saw Christianity or salvation as a covenant between God and an individual believer. So that's what it meant to be Baptist back in the 16 and 1700s. All right, so all this talk about Protestants and Baptists, what does this have to do with Catholicism? Well, I think it's got a lot to do with problems that we're facing in Catholicism in American society, and that's really what I'd like to talk about here. As Catholics, we baptize our children, we baptize our infants, and we have a very ancient tradition, and we have very profound teachings that explain why we do this. These issues can be found explained in the Summa Theologica, in the Catechisms of the Church, and so on. Yet, we live in this American society where religious freedom is established by law. And I don't know about you, but I know that I have felt this sort of pull in two different directions, where on one side, I feel that as a parent, I have the right to raise my child in what I consider to be true religion, and I have a right to expect my child to accept and practice that true religion. America, however, is more Baptist than that. And really, I would argue, and I have argued in a recent paper, that the Baptist religion, and when I say Baptist, I'm talking about this older 17th, 18th century understanding of Baptist Protestants. The Baptist religion is really what I would consider to be most American. It's really American Christianity. This idea that we're all free, we all have the right to make our own choices, we have the right to pursue our own happiness and liberty, and so on. The Baptist religion is really the most American form of Christianity. And I think that Baptist thinking, that Baptist spirit, gets into our families, gets into our children, even gets into us as parents. This Baptist way of thinking about religion presents us with some problems, and we can even see this in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, and it leads us to some real dilemmas as Catholics. So, when our children are born into our Catholic families, and we bring them to the church for baptism, and then we begin to raise them and teach them the articles of faith, which are received by faith. They're not proven to our children. We don't demonstrate the truth of them. We teach them to our children. We catechize our children. We ask our children questions and have our children recite for us memorized answers. We have our children say the Apostles' Creed, which contains the articles of faith. And if we step back and think about this, we have to ask the question, if we're honest, we have to ask the question, does this really make sense? What are we really trying to do here? What are we really thinking? What are we really doing as we catechize our children? And the only thing that I think we can say rightly is we're introducing our children to the Catholic faith. We're initiating our children into the Catholic Church, and we're providing our children with everything that they need to choose to live the Catholic life. And this Baptist choice, if you will, is to some degree recognized in the sacrament of confirmation in the Catholic Church. We can see that what the Baptists were getting at and associating with baptism, we do recognize that need for the free choosing of the faith. And that comes not by delaying baptism until a child professes to believe in the Catholic faith, but we baptize the child, and then the child, with some emerging independence as a teenager, goes through the preparation that's required for the sacrament of confirmation. And really, there's a sense that the child is choosing to some degree, even though the child may be heavily influenced by his family and culture, to a degree the child is choosing now to take up the promises of baptism and live the Catholic life. And that's signified by the sacrament of confirmation. So we sort of have this Baptist choosing moment in confirmation. But still, the child is still really not independent, certainly not financially independent, doesn't really have the freedom to set aside the religion of his parents. And I think the children in America understand that. The children in America, where this spirit of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, this right to choose, this freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and so on, our children become aware of that, and something happens under the influence of this American spirit that I don't think happened in previous cultures, in medieval society, for example. Something happens that I don't think is reasonable in itself, but I do think it's reasonable in the context of American society. These children come to a point in their life, let's say as older teenagers, especially when they get to college age, and then they get off to college and they've got some freedom, not just freedom to live, on campus by themselves without their parents and things like that. They've got some freedom to take some courses, to read some books, to hear some different voices, to learn some different philosophies, to learn some different worldviews. Also to take some American history courses, American government courses, and hear some of these ideas of the rights, of freedoms of speech and freedoms of belief and so on. And they start to think to themselves, I've never chosen my parents' religion. I've never chose to be a Catholic. My parents just made me Catholic. I've never really had the opportunity to ask all the questions that I'd like to ask. I haven't had the opportunity to test the waters in different ways of life and different cultures and different styles of life. Really, I've been raised with exposure to only one kind of life, one way of thinking, one system of beliefs. How then can I choose in freedom if I don't even know what the options are? And I think that this American spirit leads young adults to sort of put Catholicism on hold and go and explore a bit, because they're taught and taught and taught that they have to make decisions for themselves. And this is true. But the way that they go about it is somewhat bizarre, because rather than saying, well, this is the religion of my family, this is the religion that I was born into, this is the religion of mom and dad, maybe even of grandma and grandpa, and so on. Therefore, I'm going to assume that Catholicism is true and continue my devotion to Catholicism, but for the sake of freedom, I'm going to learn about other options. I'm going to learn about the Protestant Reformation. I'm going to learn about Islam. I'm going to learn about Judaism. I'm going to learn about secular agnosticism. I'm going to learn about paganism and Hellenistic philosophy and religion and so on, because I want to be able to make this choice in freedom. I want it to be my choice, and I really can't do that unless I've learned about my options. And to some degree, that's respectable. But that's not what the kids do. They don't say, as I explained, they don't say, this is the religion of my parents. I'm going to assume this to be true unless it's proven to be false. They don't say, I'm going to assume that Catholicism is innocent until proven guilty. What the kids do is the opposite. They tend to start by leaving their parents' religion, and they take the position that Catholicism is going to be held as guilty until I'm convinced that it's innocent. And this is a strange position to take. This is a strange way to start this supposed investigation into the other options. It's irrational. It's not based on probability. And I think to some degree it's kind of spiteful and hurtful towards the parents. It's very American because it rebels first and then figures out what's true later. And it's very Baptist, it's very Protestant. I'm going to do what I want to do unless you prove to me that I should do what other people advise me to do. That's not a wise way to live. But it's very American. And this is what I see young adults doing. They start by assuming that the religion of their parents is false until it's proven true. They treat almost any other religious system, any other philosophy, any other worldview as equal, if not better, than Catholicism, with no evidence. Every other culture, every other religion, every other philosophy is given this benefit of the doubt. It's given this positive, patient treatment in its investigation, whereas Catholicism is immediately doubted, and the students act like the safest thing to do is to stop practicing the religion that my parents raised me in, and having stopped my childhood religion, begin my investigation. And I just wonder, in how many areas of life would we ever do something like that? In how many areas of life would we ever do something like that? So for example, let's say, take food or clothing. If we were raised eating a certain way as children, we had certain foods were normal to us, we were raised to eat, let's say, lots of fresh foods, healthy drinks, no alcohol, no soda, no junk food. We ate salads, we ate soups, we ate fresh breads, healthy whole foods, and we were raised like that. Imagine a kid saying, well, I have a right to choose my own diet. And so even though I've been raised and I've been, healthy these 18, 19 years, um, this isn't my diet. This is my parents' idea of a diet. And so starting today, what I'm going to do is terminate all of my existing dietary habits and start eating foods and drinking drinks that I've never ever used before. I'm going to drink alcohol and soda. I'm going to eat junk food and all these different kinds of foods, all different ethnic dishes, and just start trying all kinds of different things. But the one thing I'm not going to eat is the food that I was raised on. How many people do that? Same thing with clothes. Maybe clothing is even more common. How many people say, my parents, I've been raised in this culture, we live like this, we dress like this, but I've never chosen my own style, and starting today, I'm going to completely cease to wear the clothing that I was raised wearing and start wearing things that are completely different. I don't think many people do that. But with religion, it appears that that is how young adults address this perceived need to choose their own religion. The religion of their parents, the religion that they were raised in, is given no respect, even though it's been a part of their lives from birth, and they set it aside as if it's just one of many options with no advantages over any of the others. And I don't think that that's reasonable, that kids do that. I don't understand why, in the name of making a choice of religion for myself, Catholicism is assumed to be guilty until proven innocent, and every other religion or philosophy or worldview is treated as being innocent until proven guilty. That's a strange American phenomenon that I think is part of the reason for this apparent falling away of young adult Catholics. I really don't believe it's a falling away. I believe that it's a very bizarre American cultural phenomenon that just has to work itself out over time. So I think it's going to be, common in many places for children to retain the religion of their parents, especially when circumstances are favorable. But I think it's going to be very common in many places for Catholics to see their children set the Catholic faith they were raised in on the shelf and sort of explore adulthood with the assumption that the religion that they were raised in is false and is under investigation until it's proven to be good. I think that's going to be a common response to childhood religion that we see in many young adult children. And I think that they're going to explore. I think they're going to go and test the waters. They're going to learn about other groups, learn about other kinds of people, do all these sort of things, and learn in the long run that the Catholicism that they were given at birth is the best and most perfect religion that exists, the only true religion. I think they're going to come to that realization eventually because it's true. But I think that this American Baptist religious freedom spirit is going to require them to explore as young adults, like the prodigal son, to explore and, kick the tires of every religion, as it were, take every religion for a test drive, take every worldview and idea and cultural, every culture for a test drive before finally admitting that, Mom and Dad, Catholicism actually is the best. I've seen this in my own children. I've seen my own children go through this phase where they they act as if they need to to decide this for themselves, and after some time their confidence in the world is shattered, and they begin to realize, maybe this really is the happiest and best place to be. And they'll sort of come back around to that realization. But I think that this young adult rejection of Catholicism is just a part of this American culture of freedom of expression, freedom of religion, and so on. And it's something that we have to learn to deal with and bear with as Catholic parents. I'd like to know what your experiences have been. I'd like to know what you think about this. So feel free to comment or get in touch with me and let me know if this is something you've observed, maybe even experienced yourself as a Catholic when you reached young adulthood. But I think it's an important topic for us to consider because I think it explains a lot of what we see in Catholic young adults. God bless.